My name is Frank, and I'm the man who hit Bigfoot with his truck. That was back in 1982. This isn't one of those stories you hear about grainy photos or plaster casts of footprints. This isn't a story about proof, it's about a debt. A long, silent debt that festered for 40 years in the deep woods of the Washington Cascades. And this is the story of the knock on my door that came to collect. Back then, I was just a kid, 22 years old, running logs to make a living. The truth is, I was driving too fast, pushing my beat-up Ford F-150 on a slick, rain-soaked logging road just off US Route 2. The world outside my cab was just a blur of dark green and grey, and the only sound was the high whine of the tires on wet asphalt and the frantic, rhythmic thump-thump of overworked windshield wipers trying to beat back the storm. That sound, it still haunts my quiet nights. I'm telling you this now from the same cabin I lived in back then. It's my only anchor to credibility. I'm surrounded by the same towering Douglas firs that smell of damp earth and my own unending regret. I'm not a scientist or some kind of crypto whatever. My hands know the grain of wood, the cold heft of a tire iron, the ache of a long day's work. They don't know how to operate lab equipment. The wound I've carried all these years isn't a physical one from the accident. It's a silence, a deep, hollowing silence that started the moment my headlights found that impossible shape in the road. The silence that followed me home and settled into the floorboards of this very cabin. It's the reason I'm alone here today, and it's the reason I'm finally talking. Because last Tuesday, after 40 years, the forest finally decided to talk back. That night in '82, the rain was coming down in sheets, a solid wall of water. The road was more mud than gravel. I was tired, thinking only of a hot meal and a dry bed. I came around a tight bend, and it was just. There, it wasn't a bear, it wasn't a deer. It was tall, impossibly so, covered in dark, matted hair, caught for a single, horrifying second in the twin beams of my headlights. There was no time to brake, no time to swerve. There was only the sickening, heavy thud that shuddered through the entire frame of the truck, followed by the shriek of metal as the fender buckled. The impact threw me against the steering wheel, and for a moment, the world was just the sound of my own heart hammering in my ears and the hiss of the rain on the hot engine. I had done something terrible. I knew it instantly. It was a feeling that went deeper than just a roadside accident. I killed the engine. The sudden quiet was deafening, broken only by the ticking of the cooling metal and the steady drumming of rain on the roof. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely open the door. The air that hit me was cold, thick with the smell of pine and wet dirt and something else. Something coppery and wild. I stepped out, my boots sinking into the mud. The right front of my truck was crumpled, and in the road there was nothing, just a dark, wet patch on the asphalt. But then I saw it, a trail of broken branches leading into the trees, and for just a second, a massive, hulking shape pulling itself deeper into the shadows, dragging one leg. It moved with a pained, lurching gait. I saw the glint of my own shattered headlight on its dark, wet fur. I should have followed. I should have helped. But I was 22, and I was terrified. I got back in my truck, and I drove away. My wife, Clara. She knew something was wrong the moment I walked in the door. I was pale, shaking, and I couldn't speak. I never told her what happened. Not really. I tried once a few weeks later, but the words wouldn't come out. It was like they were frozen in my throat. She used to say, the forest took my voice that night, and she was right. I became a ghost in my own home, a silent observer. I'd spend hours just staring out this window, into the tree line, listening. I wasn't listening for anything in particular, but I was listening asterisk to asterisk, the silence, to the space where a confession should have been. Clara tried to reach me, she really did. But I was already gone, lost in the woods of my own guilt. Eventually, the silence in our house became too much for her to bear. One day, she was gone, too, and the quiet got even louder. So I stayed here, 40 years. The seasons changed. The logging company sold its land. New faces moved into the valley, but I stayed. This cabin became my penance, my self-imposed prison. Every time the wind howled, I'd think of that night. Every time I heard a branch snap in the woods, my heart would seize up for a second. I told myself it was just regret, just the memory of a scared kid making a terrible choice. I learned the rhythms of the forest around Metha, chittering of squirrels, the call of the owls, the rustle of deer in the undergrowth. These sounds were my company. They were predictable, they were safe, but I was always waiting, though I didn't know for what. I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. For an account to be settled, a debt has to be paid. That was the phrase that looped in my head on the bad nights. Then came last Tuesday. It was a clear, cold evening, just after dusk. I was sitting right here, in this chair, reading an old paperback. And that's when I noticed it. The silence. Not the usual quiet of the country, but a dead, complete stillness. The chorus of evening crickets I'd listened to for decades was gone. The frogs in the creek, silent. It felt like the entire forest was holding its breath. The air grew heavy, charged, like the moments before a lightning strike. I put my book down, the hair on my arms standing on end. I've lived in these woods my entire adult life. I know their language, and this was a silence that felt wrong. It was an unnatural quiet. It was the sound of something large moving through the world, pushing all the smaller sounds out of its way. It was the sound of something arriving, and then it came. A sound that cut right through the stillness and straight into the core of my 40-year-old fear. A knock on my front door. It wasn't the frantic rapping of a lost hiker or the polite tap of a neighbor. It was a heavy, slow, deliberate knock. 3 distinct impacts that vibrated through the old wood of the cabin. Thud. Pause. Thud. It wasn't a rhythm. It was a pattern. It was a question. I didn't have to look through the peephole. I didn't need to. I knew, with a certainty that made my blood run cold, what was on the other side of that door. It had found me. After all this time, it had found me, and it was here to collect. My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild animal trapped in a cage. It remembers. That was the only thought I could form. It remembers. For a long minute, I just sat there, frozen. My mind raced back to that rainy night, to the choice I made as a terrified young man. I could do the same thing now. I could hide. I could wait for it to go away, pretend it never happened, and live with the silence for another 40 years, if I had them. The floorboards were cold under my feet as I stood up. I walked to the door, my hand hovering over the old brass knob. I thought of Clara. I thought of the long, lonely years spent listening, waiting. I thought of the shape dragging itself into the darkness, wounded because of me. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach. But something else was there too. A lifetime of regret. A deep, aching need to finally face what I had done. This was my second chance. I wasn't going to run this time. A debt has to be paid. I turned the handle. The old latch clicked loudly in the silence, and I pulled the heavy door inward. The night air that rushed in was cold and smelled of damp leaves and cold stone. And there was nothing there. My porch was empty. The steps were empty. There was only the darkness of the tree line, staring back at me, a solid wall of black. My heart sank with a confusing mix of relief and disappointment. Had I imagined it? Was my lonely mind finally breaking? But then I looked down. Lying perfectly centered on my doormat, stretching almost from one side of the doorframe to the other, was a single pine branch. It was thick as my arm, stripped completely bare of all its needles and bark, smooth as a bone. It wasn't thrown there, it was placed. It wasn't a threat, it was a statement. It was the beginning of a conversation. It was the first payment. This is where my real story begins. Not with the collision, but with that knock. And the impossible object left on my doorstep. I know it sounds crazy. I've lived with the craziness of it, the weight of it, alone for too long. If you've ever carried a secret you thought would bury you, if you've ever wondered what lurks just beyond the edge of our understanding, then you'll want to hear what happened next. This is my confession, and to know people are out there actually listening, it helps. So if you would, please hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel, and maybe share this with someone you think might understand. Believe me, you're going to want to stick around to the end to find out what it truly wanted from me. I stood there in the cold night air, the heavy, naked branch at my feet, feeling more like a judgment than a gift. My first instinct was to slam the door, to to pretend it was a prank by some local kids. But no kid could strip a branch that thick, so cleanly, so perfectly. And no prankster would know the silent language of my guilt. This was a message, a question, and it demanded an answer. What do you give the ghost you tried to erase? You can't offer an apology, not in words. You have to offer a piece of yourself. I went to the pantry and found it in the back, behind dusty cans of beans. A single jar of blackberry jam, the last one Clara made before she left. Its sweetness was tied to my deepest loss. It felt right. An offering of memory, a debt has to be paid, not just for the collision, but for the silence that followed. That evening, as the sun bled out behind the Cascades, I walked onto the porch, the cool glass of the jar heavy in my hand. I didn't leave it on the doormat. That felt too much like an order. I placed it on the wide wooden railing of the porch, a simple, open offering. The air was still, and the forest was watching. I could feel it a pressure, a focused attention that made the skin on my neck prickle. The hardest part was turning my back. Every instinct screamed at me to stay, to hide behind the window, to finally see what I had only glimpsed in a flash of panic and headlights. But I knew, with a certainty I couldn't explain, that this was a test of trust. To watch would be to break the unspoken truce. So I went inside, locked the door, and spent the night listening to the house settle. My own breathing loud in the quiet room, waiting. The next morning I woke before dawn, my stomach a tight knot of anticipation and dread. I made coffee, my hands shaking slightly as I went through the motions, delaying the inevitable. What would I find? A shattered jar. The jam smeared across my porch as a sign of contempt. Finally, I couldn't wait any longer. I opened the door slowly, peering through the crack. The porch railing was empty. The jar was gone. There was no sign of a struggle, no sticky residue, no broken glass. It had simply vanished into the night. But it hadn't been a one-way transaction. Sitting exactly where the jar had been was a small, perfectly smooth riverstone, dark grey, with a single white band running through it. I picked it up. It was impossibly warm, as if it had been held in a large living hand for hours. The warmth seeped into my palm, a tangible response. It was real. This was happening. That little stone became the Rosetta Stone for our new language. The rules of our pact were never spoken, but I learned them through trial and error, through the quiet grammar of the exchange. The first rule was clear. Transactions happened under the cover of darkness. I left my offering at dusk. It was collected sometime before dawn. The second rule was the most important. I was never to watch. The lack of any tracks. The neatness of the exchange, it all pointed to a creature that needed my ignorance as a form of respect, or maybe protection. The warmth of that stone taught me something else, too. This wasn't a scavenger taking a handout. The warmth was intent. It was a sign that my offering had been received, considered, and answered in kind. It remembers, I whispered to myself, holding the stone. It remembers everything. A week later, I decided to test the limits of this silent conversation. My favorite splitting axe had a cracked hickory handle, useless and splintered. It was a genuine problem for me, a disruption to the simple, hard work that kept my mind from wandering. It felt like a foolish, almost insane idea, but I took the two broken pieces of the handle and the heavy axe head and laid them on the railing. It wasn't food. It wasn't a simple object. It was a problem. It was a request. I was asking something of the shadow in the woods, something more than just accepting a gift. I was asking for help. As I went inside that night, the absurdity of it all hit me. I was leaving a broken tool for a monster from a ghost story, and yet a part of me, a deep and hopeful part, was certain it would understand. The next morning, the air was sharp with the scent of pine. I found the axe on the porch, whole again. It wasn't a clumsy repair. The handle was bound with something I didn't recognize, kind of tightly braided sinew. Tougher and more flexible than any leather cord I'd ever seen. The binding was sealed with a dark, amber-colored pine resin. Polished, smooth, and so hard, my thumbnail couldn't make a mark in it. I picked it up. The balance was perfect. Better than the original. The axe head was fitted so securely, it felt like it had been forged as one piece. This was the work of a master craftsman. A level of skill that defied any explanation. This wasn't an animal. This was a mind, and these were hands. It wasn't just intelligent, it was resourceful, skilled, and methodical. I took the axe and hid it. I wrapped it in an old oilcloth and put it in the back of my tool chest, buried under things I never used. It felt dangerous, like a piece of a fallen star. It was the first piece of hard evidence, the first object in a museum only I would ever see. It was the first secret I kept asterisk for asterisk it, not just about it. My phrase, the one that had haunted me for decades, began to change its meaning. Asterisk, a debt has to be paid. Asterisk, it was no longer just about the guilt of 1982. Now, it was about reciprocity. It was about honoring this bizarre, sacred contract I had entered into. I had wounded it, and now, 40 years later, it had mended something for me. The scales were slowly, impossibly, beginning to balance, and I found myself wanting more. Not more proof, but more of this connection. Our ritual settled into a quiet rhythm. The exchanges became the anchor of my week. I'd leave things I thought it might need, testing my assumptions. A block of salt I used for the deer. A handful of old steel nails I'd straightened. A worn-out leather glove. The returns were always things of the forest, but chosen with an unnerving purpose. After I left the salt, I found a bundle of cattail roots, a good source of starch, left on the railing. After the nails, a piece of chert, a type of flint rock perfect for striking sparks, appeared. The glove was met with a swatch of moss, so thick and insulating it was better than any wool. It was a conversation about survival, spoken in objects. I was learning about its world, and it was showing me it understood mine. It was a slow, careful dance of mutual discovery in the deepening twilight. Then, one week, a new sound entered our quiet world. It started as a faint, distant noise on the wind, but over a few nights it grew closer. It was a cough, a deep, dry, ragged sound that tore through the evening quiet. It was a painful, chest-rattling hack that spoke of sickness, of lungs struggling for air. It came from the tree line, always from the same general direction. Listening to it from my cabin, I felt a familiar helplessness, the same kind I felt that night on the logging road. This time, it wasn't my fault, but the sound of its suffering stirred something in me. It was more than just responsibility now. It was a painful empathy. I thought of the veterinary antibiotics I kept in a kitchen drawer for the rare times a stray farm cat got sick. A crazy idea, a dangerous one. To interfere like that felt like crossing a new, invisible line. Offering food or mending a tool was one thing. Offering medicine was another. It was a profound act of intervention, of assuming I knew what was wrong and how to fix it. What if it was the wrong medicine? What if I made it sicker? The risks were enormous. But the sound of that cough was relentless, a constant, painful reminder of a creature in distress. It kept me awake at night. After 3 days of listening to it, I couldn't bear it any longer. I took the small bottle of amoxicillin pills, counted out a dose I guessed might be right for a very large animal, and placed them in a small wooden bowl next to a pan of fresh, clean water. This was the biggest test yet. Was our pact strong enough to bear the weight of this kind of help? The following day, the woods were utterly silent. The coughing had stopped. I didn't know if that was a good sign or a bad one. The bowl and the water were gone, which meant the offering had been accepted. All I could do was wait. The silence stretched for 2 days, and a new kind of fear grew in me. Had I killed it? Had my clumsy attempt to help been a fatal mistake? My guilt, which had started to recede, came flooding back. I had broken the first rule of the wild. Don't interfere. Then, on the 3rd morning, I opened my door to a gift that took my breath away. Piled carefully on a bed of fresh moss was a huge cluster of chanterelle mushrooms, their golden caps glowing in the early morning light. They were perfectly cleaned, not a speck of dirt on them. It was a treasure, a feast, and it was a clear, unambiguous message. Thank you. Through these exchanges, I learned the unspoken prohibitions. One evening, a sudden squall delayed me, and I didn't get out to the porch until well after dark. The last light had completely faded from the sky. I left a bag of apples I'd picked, feeling uneasy about my tardiness. The next morning, the apples were still there, untouched, beaded with morning dew. They remained there for 2 more days, ignored. It was a clear, silent rebuke. The ritual had a time, and that time was dusk, the space between worlds. It wasn't a casual arrangement. It was a ceremony, and it demanded punctuality. I had broken a rule, and the consequence was a pause in our communication, a silence that felt like a cold shoulder. I never made that mistake again. The discipline of the ritual was part of the pact itself. I discovered another boundary, a more painful one. I knew the general direction it came from, a path that studiously avoided the old, scarred logging road where the accident had happened. I became curious. Was the road itself a taboo? One evening, as a test, I left a Fringa shiny new whetstone, a stump just off the shoulder of that old road, 100 yards from my cabin. It sat there for a week, untouched. I could feel its presence in the woods. I knew it was aware of the offering, but it would not approach that place. Finally, I retrieved the whetstone and placed it on the porch railing that evening. The next morning, it was gone, replaced by a hawk's feather. The message was as clear as a shout in the quiet woods. Some places hold too much pain. That road was a scar on the land and a scar on our shared history. A place we would both have to walk around forever. My life had been hollowed out by silence, first by my own guilt, then by loneliness. But now, the quiet in my cabin felt different. It was no longer an emptiness. It was a space filled with anticipation. The loneliness hadn't vanished, but it had changed its character. It was now the quiet of a man guarding a profound secret, a keeper of a sacred trust. The ritual of exchange became the very center of my world, the rhythm my heart beat to. This cabin was no longer a prison. It had become a sanctuary, an embassy between two worlds that were never meant to meet. The phrase that had once been my curse asterisk, "It remembers asterisk," had become a source of comfort. It didn't just remember the harm I had done. It remembered the jam. It remembered the mended axe. It remembered the medicine. It remembered the rules. My debt was finally being paid, one silent offering at a time. The years that followed settled into a rhythm that became the new center of my life. Our silent conversation deepened, moving beyond simple bartering for survival. One autumn, a fierce windstorm ripped through the valley. I woke to a loud crack and saw that a massive widowmaker, dead. Heavy branch was hanging precariously over the roof of my woodshed, ready to crush it. That evening, before I could figure out how to safely get it down, my gift on the porch wasn't an object, but a warning. Lying on the railing was a small, snapped branch, placed directly on top of a piece of roofing shingle I'd left out months ago. The message was unmistakable. Danger to your roof. I spent the next day painstakingly rigging a rope to pull the branch down. It was showing foresight. It was showing concern. It was actively looking out for me, and the weight of that gesture was heavier than any stone it had ever left. I started to think about what it might need, not just what it could use. Those winter nights in the Cascades are bone-chillingly cold, a cold that seeps into your very marrow. I thought of it out there, perhaps in a shallow cave or a den of damp earth, with only its own fur for warmth. So one evening, I left out one of Clara's old wool blankets. It was heavy, a bit frayed, but clean and warm. It felt like a deeply personal gift, another piece of my past offered up to the woods. I felt a pang of loss as I left it on the railing, but it felt right. The next morning, the blanket was gone. In its place, arranged in a neat, semicircular pattern at the base of the porch steps, was a thick bed of pine boughs. Laid so densely, they formed an insulating mat against the icy wood. It understood comfort. It understood the cold. It had taken my warmth and offered its own version in return. A practical and deeply touching gesture. But our quiet world couldn't stay quiet forever. The first intrusion wasn't a person, but a sound. A low, persistent roar that started carrying on the wind from a few miles east. Chainsaws. A new housing development was clearing a massive swath of old-growth forest. That sound became a constant, dull headache, a grinding reminder of the shrinking wilderness. I noticed the change in the forest immediately. The deer were more skittish. The owls seemed to have moved on, and the exchanges on my porch became hesitant. On days when the chainsaws were loudest, my offerings would sometimes remain untouched for a day or two. The noise was a wall between us. It was a physical manifestation of the world that I had tried to shut out, and it was tearing through the sanctuary I had so carefully, so selfishly, guarded for both of us. The peace I had found was being eroded, one felled tree at a time. I started talking to myself more, a habit I thought I'd lost. Out loud, I'd whisper the same thought over and over while staring into the tree line. They're getting too close. It became a kind of mantra, a prayer of anxiety. The sound of their engines, the distant shouts of men, it all felt like a violation. This small patch of woods, this fragile embassy I had built, was an island, and the tide of the modern world was rising around it. The gifts from the forest became more urgent, more focused on concealment. I'd find large swaths of bark, perfect for camouflage, or bundles of ferns that, when laid out, could hide the path to my back door. It was no longer just about survival. It was about hiding. It knew what the sound of those engines meant. It knew what men with machines did to the woods. And it was trying to teach me how to disappear alongside it. Then came the new sound, the one that broke everything. It was a high-pitched electric whine, like a metallic wasp angry at the sky. A drone. Some tourist from the new development, no doubt, trying to get an unspoiled aerial shot of the mountains. It buzzed over the canopy, a sterile, technological eye in a place that should have been sacred and unseen. I felt a surge of rage, so intense it made my hands tremble. This was a different kind of invasion. The chainsaws were brute force, but this was a spy, a peeping Tom in God's country. I stood on my porch, watching the small black speck dart back and forth, and I felt utterly powerless. I could feel the forest holding its breath again. That same unnatural quiet from the night of the first knock, but this time it was laced with a modern, buzzing paranoia. They're getting too close. It wasn't just a fear anymore. It was a fact. Suddenly, from the deep woods to my right, came a sound I had never heard before. It wasn't a cough or a grunt. It was a sharp, guttural hoot. A sound that was pure alarm. A command. It meant danger, human. It meant threaten now. The drone, perhaps drawn by the sound or maybe just by chance, veered and dipped lower, heading directly towards the part of the forest the sound had come from. My heart leaped into my throat. The creature had given away its position. It had reacted, and in doing so, it had painted a target on itself for that unblinking camera eye. I wanted to yell, to shout for it, to be quiet, to run. But I was frozen, a spectator in a disaster of my own making. I had invited this connection, and now I was about to watch it be discovered and destroyed by a cheap piece of consumer electronics. A debt has to be paid, I thought. But not like this, not by him. Just as the drone dipped below the tree line, its buzzing sound changed. It sputtered, wind at a higher pitch, and then cut out completely. There was a moment of perfect silence, and then the sound of it crashing through the branches, a series of sharp cracks and snaps, ending with a dull, plastic thud. It was down, but I knew the reprieve was temporary. Whoever was flying that thing had a GPS location. They would come looking for it. They would walk right past my cabin, right into the heart of the woods, to retrieve their toy. And what they might find there would be far more than just a broken drone. The creature let out a low, rumbling growl, a sound of agitation and fear. It was still too close. One had to get to it first. There was no choice. This was my responsibility. The pact demanded it. I didn't even grab a coat. I launched myself off the porch and scrambled into the undergrowth, moving faster than I had in 20 years. Thorn bushes ripped at my clothes and skin. Branches whipped my face, and my lungs burned with the cold air. I ran, fueled by pure adrenaline and a terrifying sense of urgency. Every rustle in the leaves sounded like the drone's owner approaching. Every snapped twig under my boots sounded like a gunshot in the quiet woods. I was a frantic old man, crashing through the forest, trying to beat a younger, fitter person to a piece of wreckage. I had to find it. I had to erase the evidence. The intimacy of our quiet exchanges had been shattered, and now I was paying the price, a frantic, heart-pounding race against exposure. This was the real world crashing into our fragile one. I found it in a small clearing, about 100 yards from my property line. It was a mangled wreck of black plastic and wires. One of its propellers was snapped, and its little camera lens, its eye, was shattered, pointing blankly at the sky. It felt like I'd found the corpse of some malevolent insect. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed a heavy rock and brought it down on the main body of the drone, again and again, smashing the plastic, the circuit boards, the battery. I was grunting with the effort, a wildness taking me over. I had to make it unrecognizable. I had to destroy the memory card, the GPS tracker, everything. It was a desperate, violent act of protection. As I stood there, panting, surrounded by the debris, I felt a flicker of the same terror I'd felt 40 years ago. But this time, I wasn't running away from the aftermath. I was trying to erase it. Just as I scattered the last of the pieces under a thicket of ferns, I heard it. A voice, a man, shouting, "Hey, who's over there?" My blood ran cold. I dropped behind a fallen log, my heart hammering against my ribs, trying to make myself as small as possible. I could hear him crashing through the brush, getting closer. I heard that, "I know someone's here." He sounded angry, entitled. I lay there, face pressed into the damp earth, smelling the rot and the soil, praying he wouldn't see me. He came into the clearing, a young guy in a clean hiking jacket, and saw the spot where the drone had been. He cursed, kicking at the leaves. He looked around, his eyes scanning the trees, passing right over my hiding spot. After a few agonizing minutes, he gave up and stomped off, his angry muttering fading into the distance. The near disaster had a real and immediate cost. For the next week, the woods were silent. Not just the unnatural pre-knock silence, but a new kind of quiet. A dead, empty silence. My offerings on the porch railing went untouched. The apples rotted. The water grew stale. I had smashed the drone, but I had also smashed the trust between us. The violence of my act, the proximity of another human, the shouting it, had been too much. The sanctuary had been breached, and the creature had retreated into a deeper, more inaccessible part of the wilderness. The loneliness that returned was worse than anything I had felt before, because now I knew what I was missing. I had been given a glimpse of a profound connection, and my own world had ripped it away. They're getting too close, I had thought. And I had been right. My paranoia bloomed like a toxic mold. Every car that slowed on the road outside my property was, in my mind, the drone owner, back for another look. Every hiker I saw in the distance was a scout. The secret I had carried for so long, which had finally started to feel like a shared honor, now felt like a dangerous liability. It was a weight on my chest, a constant, low-grade fever of anxiety. The cabin no longer felt like an embassy. It felt like a target. I spent my days watching, waiting not for a gift on the porch, but for a knock on the door from a park ranger or a sheriff's deputy. I had protected the creature, but I had exposed myself. The pact had demanded a sacrifice, and the price was my own peace of mind. I was truly alone again, trapped between a world that wouldn't understand, and a world that was now too frightened to speak to me. Then, after 2 full weeks of emptiness, I found something on the porch railing one morning. It was so small, I almost missed it. A bird's nest, perfectly formed, but empty. It was incredibly fragile, a delicate cup woven from twigs, moss, and strands of what looked like deer fur. It wasn't a treasure like the mushrooms, or a tool like the mended axe. It was something else entirely. It was a symbol, a home that had been abandoned, a fragile thing that had survived. I picked it up, my rough fingers fumbling with its delicacy. It was a question, an apology, and a statement all in one. It felt like a gesture of forgiveness. Perhaps it understood the violence of my act was done in its defense. The bond wasn't broken, just badly frayed. We were still connected, but our world had become a much more dangerous place. The final price of my actions arrived not with a knock, but in newsprint. A neighbor, who still brought my mail once a week, left a copy of the local valley newspaper on my porch. And there, on the front page, was a small article. Authorities investigate vandalism. Reports of strange activity near New Skyridge development. It mentioned a drone being maliciously destroyed, and quoted the owner talking about strange noises and feeling like he was being watched. The article ended by saying the Forest Service was increasing patrols in the area to investigate unusual wildlife patterns reported by hunters. They were coming. Not for Bigfoot, not yet. They were coming because a man with a broken toy had pointed them in my direction. The circle was tightening. My quiet, secret life was about to end. The knock on the door was coming, but this time it would be human. That winter came on hard and fast, a brutal reply to the heat of the newspaper article. The Forest Service patrols became more frequent, their green trucks a slow, menacing presence on the road below my property. I felt like a bug under a magnifying glass. The exchanges on the porch stopped completely. The silence from the forest was no longer a conversation paused. It was a wall of ice. My own silence, the one I had cultivated for 40 years, was now a trap. I couldn't talk to the mailman, couldn't look a ranger in the eye without feeling the weight of my secret pressing down on my tongue. The paranoia that had been a low fever was now a full-blown delirium. Every rustle of the wind in the bare branches sounded like footsteps. Every shadow seemed to hold a pair of binoculars. I had never felt more alone, perched on the edge of a discovery that would ruin 2 lives, his and mine. The phrase kept circling in my head, darker than ever. Asterisk, they're getting too close. Asterisk, then the blizzard hit. Not a gentle flurry, but a proper Cascade Mountain monster, a whiteout that erased the world. The snow came down not in flakes, but in a solid, churning wall. Driven by a wind that screamed like a banshee around the corners of the cabin, the power went out on the first night. The world shrank to the flickering circle of my kerosene lamp. For 3 days, I was snowbound, a prisoner in my own home, the drifts piling up against the doors and windows. The only sound was the howling wind and the creak and groan of the old cabin's timbers as they fought against the weight of the snow. In that enforced isolation, a strange peace settled over me. The rangers couldn't get up here. The drone owner was a distant memory. For a moment, the island was safe again, surrounded by a moat of impenetrable white. It was just me and the storm and the deep, silent woods. On the 4th day, the wind died down, but the cold deepened, a piercing, dangerous cold that I felt even indoors. I was running low on firewood for the main stove. I had a huge stack in the woodshed, but getting there meant wading through 4 feet of fresh, heavy snow. I put on every layer I owned, my breath pluming in the frigid air of the cabin. It was a short distance, maybe 50 yards, but it looked like an Arctic expedition. I told myself it was a simple task, the kind I'd done 1,000 times. But I'm not 22 anymore. I'm 72. My joints ached, and a weariness had settled deep in my bones that had nothing to do with the weather. But I had no choice. Stay inside and freeze, or go out and fight for warmth. I grabbed the snow shovel, took a deep breath, and pushed the door open against a solid wall of white. The effort was brutal. Each step was a battle, plunging my leg deep into the powder, then hauling it out again. The cold was a physical thing, a crushing weight on my chest. My lungs burned. I made it to the woodshed, panting, sweat freezing on my forehead. I loaded up a canvas carrier with as much split oak as I could manage, the weight of it pulling at my shoulders. The journey back was even worse. Halfway to the cabin, my vision started to swim. A sharp, searing pain shot through my chest and down my left arm. It wasn't muscle ache. It was a warning light I'd been ignoring for years. I dropped the firewood. My legs gave out. I fell face first into the snowdrift, the whiteness swallowing me whole. The world went grey, the silence of the snow deafening. My last thought wasn't of Clara or of my regrets. It was just a quiet, final understanding. Asterisk, so this is it. A debt has to be paid. Asterisk, I was going to die out here, a frozen monument to my own foolish pride and a lifetime of secrets. I woke up to warmth, not the searing pain in my chest, but the gentle, radiating warmth of a fire. I was on my porch, not in the snow. My head was propped against the cabin wall. I was groggy, disoriented. The sky was a deep twilight purple, meaning hours had passed. How did I get here? I tried to sit up, a groan escaping my lips. My body ached with a profound, deep soreness, as if I'd been manhandled. That's when I noticed the blankets. I was covered by the old, heavy wool blanket I kept on the foot of my own bed. It was tucked around me tightly. Someone had brought it from inside my house, but the doors were locked. The snow was still 4 feet deep. A wave of utter confusion and primal fear washed over me. This was impossible. My mind was playing tricks on me, a final hallucination before the end. But there was something else. Under the wool blanket, draped over my chest, was another covering. It was incredibly heavy, and the air around me was thick with a wild, musky scent, like damp earth and wet animal fur and something ancient. I pulled the wool blanket back with a shaking hand. It was a hide, a massive, thick pelt of some kind, covered in coarse, dark hair flecked with grey. It was still radiating a faint, living warmth. I hadn't been hallucinating. I hadn't crawled here. I had been found. I had been dragged from my snowy grave, pulled onto the porch, and covered not just with my own blanket, but with the very thing that kept the creature of the woods warm. It had saved me. It had gone inside my home, a place it had never been invited, to get the blanket. The rules had been broken, but for my sake, through the swirling snow that was just beginning to fall again, my eyes strained towards the tree line, and I saw it. It wasn't hiding. It was standing at the edge of the woods, a towering, dark shape against the deepening twilight, watching me. It was old. I could see that even from this distance. Its posture was heavy, its movements slow. Its shoulders were stooped, like an old man carrying a great weight. It was just a silhouette of grief and time. But then it shifted its weight, and for a single heart-stopping moment, the angle was just right. I could see the thick, gnarled, hairless line of a massive scar running down its right thigh, exactly where the crumpled fender of my Ford F-150 would have connected 40 years ago. It was him, the one, the very creature I had struck down and left for dead. The sight of that scar broke something open in me. 40 years of guilt, of shame, of a young man's cowardice. It all came crashing down. But the guilt was instantly transformed. It washed away, and in its place was a profound, aching connection that felt more real than anything I had ever known. This creature, who had every right to hate me, to want revenge, to leave me to freeze in the snow as I had left it to bleed in the rain, had instead saved my life. It had carried my limp body, tended to me, and stood watch over me. The debt I thought I was repaying with jam and nails was a child's game. The real debt wasn't mine to pay. It was his to forgive, and in this single, silent act of mercy, he had *it remembers. The phrase echoed in my mind. But now it was a song of grace, not a toll of guilt. It remembered the injury, and it chose to heal. A week passed in a blur of recovery. The storm broke, and I slowly regained my strength, my heart filled with a fragile, new kind of hope. The porch remained empty. I didn't expect any more exchanges. What more could be said? He had given me my life back. The debt was settled. But on the 8th day, I opened my door to find a new offering. It was sitting in the exact center of the doormat. It was a small, crudely carved wooden figure, no bigger than my hand. It was vaguely humanoid, with a large head and long arms, but it was clearly the work of something that did not have nimble fingers. It was a doll, a child's toy. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't a thank you. This wasn't a trade. This was a piece of information, a picture. He wasn't just showing me skill. He was showing me a reason. It wasn't asking for itself. The next day, another object appeared. It was a small, tightly woven bundle of reeds, tied with a strand of dried grass. It looked like a brush, or a sample. I picked it up, my fingers tracing the expert weave. But as I turned it over, I saw it. Woven into the reeds were strands of hair. Some were coarse, grey-flecked, and wiry his hair. But intertwined with them were other strands, much softer, finer, and a lighter shade of brown. They were thinner, like the hair of a doe, or of a child. I sat down heavily in my doorway, the small bundle of reeds in my trembling hand. The cough, the warnings about the chainsaws, the frantic reaction to the drone, the doll, the two types of hair. Pistas were emerging, pointing to the truth. All the pieces clicked into place with a sickening, heartbreaking clarity. I finally understood. The knock on my door, the rituals, the rescue, none of it was ever for him. He wasn't alone. My purpose, which had been a selfish quest for atonement, was suddenly clarified into something fierce and protective. He hadn't come to me for revenge for 1982. He had come to me because he remembered the one human in this entire forest who had shown a flicker of remorse. A glimmer of being different from the ones with chainsaws and drones and traps. He had tested me. He had taught me. He had saved me. And now he was asking me for help, not for himself, but for his family. The weight of this revelation was 100 times heavier than the guilt I had carried for 40 years. It wasn't just a secret I was protecting anymore. It was a family, and they were in danger. The stakes had been raised from a personal secret to a sacred trust. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that I would burn down the world to keep it. This is more than just about a creature in the woods. It's about a promise. It's about looking at your past mistakes and having the chance to do something right, no matter the cost. And I can't help but feel that some of you out there might know what that feels like. To carry something, if this part of my story has touched you, if you understand the weight of that choice I'm now facing, I'd ask you again to show your support. Hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming, and please, share this. The more people who hear this, the less alone I feel in carrying it. Trust me, what happens next is the reason I'm risking everything to tell this story in the first place. Stay with me. The knock on the door came 2 weeks later. It wasn't the familiar, heavy pattern that had become the rhythm of my life. It was a series of sharp, polite, human raps that made my heart seize. Standing on my porch was a woman who didn't belong here. She was maybe in her late 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing, and her practical hiking gear looked brand new, straight out of a catalogue. She held up an ID badge. Dr. Eris Thorne, U.S. Forest Service. Biologist, she smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. She said she was leading a study on anomalous wildlife migration patterns, something about the new developments pushing fauna into unusual territories. It was a perfect, plausible lie, but I knew, with the certainty of a man guarding a secret, that she wasn't here for the deer or the bears. She was here for the silence. She was here because of the drone, the hunters, the whispers. She was the face of the systematic world I had feared my whole life, and she was standing on my doorstep. Just have a few questions for the residents in this sector. Mr. Olson, she said, her voice calm and professional. She didn't ask to come in, but her presence filled the doorway, blocking out the light. Have you noticed any unusual nocturnal sounds lately? Anything outside the norm of owls or coyotes? Her questions were scalpels, laid out on a sterile tray. I leaned against the doorframe, trying to look like a tired old man, not a conspirator. I mumbled something about the wind in the pines, the way sound travels at night, and tracks. She pressed on, her gaze sweeping past me into the dark interior of my cabin. Anything larger than a black bear? We've had some unusual casts brought in by hunters. I just shook my head, feeling the lie stick to my tongue like tar. Every denial felt like a confession. I could feel her analyzing my pauses, my posture, the tremor in my hand. She knew I was hiding something. The air in my own home grew thin, unbreathable. She was a hunter of a different kind, and she was tracking me. She thanked me for my time, her professional smile back in place. It was a dismissal, and I felt a wave of relief, so strong my knees felt weak. But as she turned to leave, she paused, her eyes fixed on the fence post at the edge of my small yard, the one that marked the path to the woodshed. That's odd, she said, her voice now genuinely curious. She walked over to it, her boots making soft crunching sounds in the gravel. She pinched something between her thumb and forefinger. Just a minute. She pulled a small plastic evidence bag from her pocket and carefully placed a single long coarse grey hair inside. My blood ran cold. It was his, left behind, maybe from weeks ago. A careless remnant of our now shattered routine. She held the bag up to the light, and I saw a flicker in her eyes. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was confirmation. The hunt was over, and the investigation had just begun. In that moment, she wasn't a biologist anymore. She was the enemy, and she had just found her smoking gun. The direct pressure stopped, but the passive pressure became a suffocating blanket. Her green Forest Service truck became a permanent fixture on the access road a quarter-mile down from my cabin. It was just far enough away to be plausibly official business, but close enough that I knew what it was. Surveillance. Sometimes, I'd catch a glint of light off a lens from the tree line across the road, binoculars, a spotting scope. I stopped using my front porch altogether. I felt like a bug pinned to a board. The sanctity of my isolation was gone, replaced by a constant, grinding paranoia. I had gone from being the keeper of a secret to the prime suspect in an investigation. The forest had always watched me with what felt like a benign, ancient patience. Now, I was being watched by my own kind, with a cold, methodical hunger for the truth I was hiding. The phrase echoed in my mind, a frantic, desperate beat. Asterisk, they're getting too close. They're getting too close. Asterisk, the woods went completely dead. The ritual, which had been so brutally interrupted by the drone incident, was now definitively over. The porch railing, once a sacred altar for our silent communication, remained empty. Morning after morning, I'd opened the door to nothing but cold, dew-covered wood. No stones, no mushrooms, no messages. The creatures were smart. They knew the scent of a new human. They knew the threat that lingered at the edge of their territory. My presence, which had once been a beacon of trust, was now a liability, a danger zone they had to avoid. I had led the enemy to their doorstep. The silence that returned was worse than the 40 years of quiet that preceded it. It was an accusatory silence, a silence born of fear. I had failed in my most sacred duty. I had broken the pact not by watching or being late, but by being human, by drawing the attention of a world that only knows how to capture and dissect. My cabin, once a sanctuary, became a pressure cooker. I was trapped inside with my own spiraling thoughts. I'd spent hours replaying my conversation with Thorn, dissecting every word, every glance. Did I blink too much? Was my voice shaking? I started taking different paths to my woodshed, checking the trees for anything out of place. And one day, I found it. Tucked behind the bark of an old Douglas fir, just off my property line, was a small, camouflaged trail camera, its dark lens aimed directly at my back door. The violation was so profound it made me physically sick. They weren't just watching me, they were mapping my entire life, my every move. They were building a case, not against a creature, but against me. I was the gatekeeper, and they were patiently, systematically, figuring out how to pick the lock, or, more likely, just break down the door. My secret was no longer a weight. It was a ticking bomb strapped to my chest. The pressure was no longer personal. It became institutional. A second vehicle appeared alongside Thorn's truck, a white SUV with government plates, but no Forest Service markings. Men in plain clothes with serious faces would get out and walk the perimeter of the public land bordering my property, holding devices that looked like GPS mappers. They weren't hiding anymore. They were staging. It felt like an army setting up a siege line. They were creating a detailed, three-dimensional map of the terrain, logging every game trail, every ravine, every potential den site. They were closing the net, inch by painstaking inch. I was just a geographical data point to them now, the epicenter of the anomaly they were determined to corner. They probably thought I was feeding it, that I had it tamed like some kind of pet. They had no concept of the debt, the pact, the 40 years of shared history. They only saw a puzzle, and they were bringing all their resources to bear to solve it. I finally understood what they wanted, and it was far worse than a grainy photograph to splash across the news. Dr. Thorne, with her biologist title and her scientific curiosity, wasn't looking for proof. She was looking for a specimen. I imagined them with tranquilizer darts and heavy nets, a helicopter with a cargo sling. I imagined them closing in on the family, on the juvenile, whose only crime was being born. They wouldn't see a father trying to protect his family. They would see a biological miracle, a missing link, the scientific discovery of the millennium. They would cage it, study it, dissect it, and display its bones in a museum. They would turn a living, breathing being with memory and emotion into a thing. Asterisk, they don't know what they're looking for. Asterisk, I thought, staring out at the woods where I knew they were hiding, terrified. Asterisk, but they would find it anyway. Asterisk, my role had shifted again. I was no longer just a protector. I was the last line of defense against an extinction event. Desperation began to cloud my judgment. The silence from the woods was a constant scream in my ears, and the surveillance was a physical weight on my shoulders. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to warn them. I had to let them know the circle was tightening. I grabbed an old kerosene lantern and was halfway out the back door, intent on heading deep into the territory where I knew they hid, to leave some kind of sign, any kind of warning. But I stopped on the porch, my hand on the cold doorknob. My feet were frozen to the spot. The trail camera, the thermal imaging they were probably using at night. If I went out there, I wouldn't be a messenger. I would be a Judas goat. I would lead them straight to the family I was trying to save. I was utterly, completely trapped. I couldn't communicate. I couldn't act. I couldn't run. All I could do was wait for them to make their move. My own conscience, a tormenting, helpless spectator to the disaster I had set in motion. The feeling of inevitability became a certainty. The air grew thick with it, just like it did before the blizzard. Something was about to break. Thorne and her team were too close, too systematic. They wouldn't just give up and go home. They were professionals, and they had the scent of their prey. The time for quiet exchanges and silent understanding was over. The modern world, with its drones and its cameras, and its relentless need to know everything, had found our quiet corner, and it was going to tear it apart to get what it wanted. I looked out my window at my old, weathered woodshed, at the trees that had been my silent companions for decades. I was going to lose it all. That much was clear. The only question left was whether I would lose it by surrendering or by fighting back. The debt, the true and final payment, was coming due. And I knew, with a terrible clarity, that the price would be my entire world. The knock was coming, and this time it would break down the door. The final knock came on a night so still, you could hear your own blood moving. It was the same pattern, the same voice I had learned by heart. Thud, pause, thud. But this time, it had a different grammar. It wasn't a question, it was a summons. An urgent, desperate plea that vibrated through the floorboards and up my spine. I opened the door, and for the first time, it didn't retreat. It stood there at the edge of the woods, a towering silhouette of grief against the starlight. Its massive shape a solid block of darkness. It didn't make a sound. But it didn't have to. It gestured with its massive head, a slow, deliberate turn towards the deep ravine on the north side of my property, a place of tangled thorns and treacherous drops. Then it let out a single, low, mournful sound, a guttural ripple of pain. I understood. It wasn't here about the past. It was here because it had run out of options, and it was placing its entire world in my trembling human hands. I followed without a second thought, grabbing only a powerful flashlight. The path was dark and treacherous, but I moved with a desperate certainty. The smell hit me first, a coppery animal temps of fear and blood that cut through the clean scent of pine. It led me to the edge of the ravine, and the flashlight beam cut through the darkness to reveal a scene from a nightmare. The truth, the real reason. It wasn't about me at all. Down in the gully, its mate was caught. Her right leg was trapped in the rusted, steel jaws of a massive, illegal bear trap, the kind loggers used to set and forget 50 years ago. She was exhausted, her fur matted with blood and dirt. Huddled against her, whimpering with a high-pitched, terrified sound, was a juvenile. A child, small, spindly, and utterly terrified. This was the secret. This was the family. They were cornered not by a mythical beast, but by the brutal, careless cruelty of my own kind. A ghost of human violence, left to rust in the woods, had finally found a victim. In that horrifying, illuminated moment, 40 years of history rearranged themselves in my mind. The knock on my door, all those years ago, wasn't an accusation, it was a test. The creature I hit had remembered me not as an attacker, but as the one human who had shown a flicker of remorse, who hadn't gotten out of his truck with a weapon. The years of our ritual, the jam, the mended axe, the medicine, they were an interview. A long, slow vetting process. Was I trustworthy? Did I understand the grammar of respect? He wasn't asking for revenge for an accident. He was asking for help against an act of intentional, forgotten malice. He was gambling that the man who had carried the guilt of one mistake for a lifetime was the only man who could be trusted to fix another. Asterisk, a debt has to be paid. Asterisk, the phrase was no longer about my guilt. It was about his faith. and I was about to either honor it or shatter it completely. There was no time to think. I scrambled back to the cabin, my mind a frantic blank slate of action. I grabbed the heaviest tools I owned, a long steel crowbar, heavy bolt cutters, a small hydraulic jack from under my truck. Back in the ravine, the scene was worse. The female was weakening, her breathing shallow. The old one watched from the shadows, a low, constant growl of agony and fear rumbling in his chest. I went to work on the trap, jamming the crowbar into the spring mechanism. The metal was thick, fused with rust and time. I put my entire weight into it, grunting, my muscles screaming, the rusted metal groaning in protest. The sound was obscene in the quiet woods. My own heart hammered against my ribs, a painful echo of the night I collapsed in the snow. But I couldn't stop. I had to free them. With every failed attempt, the sound of my own failure echoed off the ravine walls. Then, cutting through the night, a new sound. The telltale crackle of a radio, followed by a calm, female voice carried on the wind. Thorn, grid 7 is clear. Moving to grid 8, keep your spacing. They were here. They were sweeping the woods, a systematic grid search, closing in. Their technology, their discipline, their relentless purpose, it was all converging on this one small, sacred, terrible place. I could almost hear the soft tread of their boots on the pine needles, see the infrared glow of their night vision. They were quiet, professional, and they were coming to turn this family into a specimen. My frantic, clumsy efforts with a crowbar felt pathetic, a child's tantrum against an oncoming tidal wave. Asterisk, they're getting too close. Asterisk, the thought screamed, no longer a whisper of paranoia, but the final, frantic tolling of a bell. Time was gone. There were no more moves to make. I looked at the trapped mother, her eyes glazed with pain. I looked at the terrified juvenile, a creature that had never known anything but the safety of the deep woods. And I looked up, through the trees, at the dark shape of my own cabin. My life was there. Every book I'd ever read, the chair Clara had sat in, 40 years of solitude and regret, and finally, peace. The choice was laid bare. I could be the man who saved them by leading Thorn right here, by trading their freedom for a footnote in a scientific journal. I could trade their souls for a moment of fame as the man who proved it all. Or I could save them for real. I could erase them from the map. A debt has to be paid, the final, ultimate payment. And the currency was fire. It was the only language the modern world would understand and obey without question. I dropped the crowbar. I didn't say a word. I just ran. My legs pumped, my lungs burned, and I ran not away from the search team, but straight towards my own life, intent on its destruction. I kicked in the door of the old woodshed, the place where he had mended my axe, a place of creation. I grabbed the red can of gasoline. I didn't think, I just acted. I sloshed the fuel over the stacks of dry split oak, over the walls, over the floor, where I had stood so many times. The fumes were dizzying, an acrid smell of finality. I stepped back, took the old kerosene lamp from its hook, and threw it inside. The explosion wasn't a bang. It was a deep, hungry asterisk, whoosh, asterisk, as the world I had built was devoured by a plume of orange flame. Black smoke billowed into the night sky, a pillar of pure chaos, an emergency beacon that would pull every human for 10 miles to this spot and away from the ravine. The distant wail of sirens began almost immediately. While the world rushed towards the fire, I rushed back into the darkness. Adrenaline coursed through me, a fire of my own. I wedged the crowbar into the trap's jaws one last time and threw every ounce of my being into it. With a screech of tortured metal, the rusty spring finally gave way. The jaws popped open. The female collapsed, but the old one was there in an instant, helping her up, nudging her forward. He got his family moving. The juvenile, clinging to its mother's back. Before they disappeared, the old one stopped. He turned his head and looked directly at me. For a single, eternal second, our eyes met across the gully. There was no gesture, no sound. There was only a profound, silent acknowledgement. A debt settled. A trust fulfilled. Then they dissolved into the deep woods, becoming shadows among shadows, leaving me alone with the fire and the sirens. A week later, my world was ash. insurance forms, and sympathetic questions from deputies. Faulty wiring, I'd said. A tragic, simple accident. As I was clearing debris, I saw her from my cabin window. Eris Thorne. She was alone, walking the perimeter of the burn. Then, she followed the tracks I couldn't hide from that night, a path leading straight to the ravine. I watched, my heart frozen, as she stood over the discarded, broken bear trap. She saw it all, the trap, the bloodstains, the massive tracks leading away into the wilderness, and my own boot prints leading back to the fire. She looked up and saw me watching her, our eyes locked. She raised her radio to her mouth, and I braced for the end. I heard her voice, cold and professional. This is Thorne. Investigation of the source is complete. Confirmed as faulty wiring in an outbuilding. All clear. Repeat, all clear. She knew, and she lied. She saw the whole story, and she chose to bury it. I'm truly alone now. The porch railing is just wood. The forest is quiet again, but the silence is not empty. It's full of an ending. The debt is paid. The greatest twist wasn't discovering that a monster was real. It was discovering that a human I had marked as the enemy was capable of a quiet, world-altering act of grace. She had her own pact to honor, with a conscience I never knew she had. We are the keepers of a shared secret, she and I. Two strangers bound by a truth we can never speak, and I understand now. We aren't defined by the monsters we hunt or the things we prove, but by the debts we choose to repay, and the fragile secrets we choose to protect. Some things are meant to stay lost, not for their sake, but for ours. They remind us that the world is bigger and stranger than our maps, and that mystery is a form of hope. Thank you for staying with me, for listening to this entire confession. If you made it this far, please consider leaving a like, and subscribe to the channel so these stories continue to be told. Now, look for the next video appearing on your screen. There are always more secrets in the dark, waiting for a voice.